The morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains in soft golden rays as Margaret stirred her coffee with slow, deliberate movements. The spoon clinked gently against the ceramic mug, creating a small, hollow sound that seemed to echo through the quiet kitchen. 10 years of mornings like this, just her and Emma, had given her a certain rhythm, a way of moving through the world that didn't require much thinking anymore. Loss had taught her that much. The accident that had taken Richard seemed like it happened in another lifetime, though some days the pain still caught her off guard, appearing suddenly between heartbeats like an unwelcome visitor who still had a key to the house. She'd spent the first few years after his death in a fog, barely remembering what she'd done on any given day, existing in a kind of suspended animation where time had lost all meaning. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, she'd emerged from that fog. She'd learned to function again. She'd learned to be both mother and father to Emma, learning new skills on the fly, reading books about single parenting at 2 a.m, attending support groups where other widows shared their experiences of loss and survival. The kitchen was painted a soft cream color, a neutral choice that Margaret had made 5 years ago, when she'd finally decided to make the house feel like hers, rather than like a museum dedicated to the life she'd had with Richard. The cabinets were original to the 1970s renovation, made of a dark wood that had grown increasingly dull with age, but Margaret had grown fond of their solidity, their quiet presence in the room. The countertops were white laminate, cracked in one corner where Emma had dropped a cast-iron skillet 3 years ago. Margaret had never bothered to replace them. Emma burst through the kitchen door with the kind of energy that only 17-year-olds possessed. She moved through the space with the unconscious grace of youth, her backpack slung over one shoulder in a way that would undoubtedly cause her back problems later in life, though she'd never believe Margaret's warnings about proper posture. Her face was flushed with the kind of excitement that made Margaret's chest tighten with a mixture of joy and something else, a vague, undefined concern that she couldn't quite name but had learned not to ignore. She knew that expression intimately. She'd worn it once, a lifetime ago, when Richard had first started paying attention to her in the halls of their high school, back when the future had stretched out before them like an unwritten book filled with blank pages waiting to be filled. She'd worn that expression when Richard had first kissed her behind the bleachers at the football field, on an autumn night when the air had been crisp and the stars had seemed impossibly bright. She'd worn it when they'd snuck away to the river to watch the sunset, lying on a blanket on the bank, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. She'd worn it when life had still felt full of infinite possibility, when the world had seemed to promise that anything could happen if you wanted it badly enough. "Mom, I'm heading to the library after school," Emma said, not quite meeting her eyes as she moved toward the refrigerator with the familiarity of long habit. Her voice carried a studied casualness that immediately put Margaret on alert. "I have a big project due." Margaret set down her mug carefully on the wooden table, the ceramic making a soft, deliberate sound against the wood. She'd learned to pay attention to these small sounds over the years, the way silence could speak volumes, the way a daughter's words could carry hidden meanings beneath their surface, the subtle shifts in tone that indicated truth or deception. When you'd spent 10 years raising a child largely on your own, you developed a certain sensitivity to these things. "Again?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice light and casual, the tone of a mother making simple conversation rather than the tone of someone asking a significant question. "That's the 3rd time this week, isn't it?" Emma pulled open the refrigerator door, and cool air spilled out into the kitchen, carrying the mixed smells of vegetables and milk and the plastic containers of leftovers that Margaret had been meaning to clean out for days. Emma reached for the orange juice, her fingers wrapping around the plastic jug with practiced ease. "Mrs. Patterson assigned something massive," Emma replied, moving with exaggerated casualness toward the counter, her back to Margaret as she spoke. She poured the orange juice into a glass with the concentrated attention usually reserved for tasks requiring tremendous precision. "It's a research-heavy project. I need the quiet of the library to focus." Something in the tone didn't land quite right. The words were reasonable, even believable, but there was an undercurrent beneath them, a tension in the way Emma had phrased the response. Margaret had spent 10 years learning to read the smallest tells, the slight catch in Emma's voice that appeared when she was being less than truthful, the way her fingers adjusted her backpack strap one too many times in a nervous gesture. The manner in which she suddenly became very interested in studying the pattern of the wood grain on the cutting board, treating it as if it were the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. But Margaret said nothing. Emma was 17 now, nearly an adult. She deserved some privacy, some space to develop her own interior world, her own sense of self that existed independently of her mother's knowledge and oversight. Margaret had learned this lesson through trial and error. Through countless parenting books she'd read late at night when Emma was sleeping, books that promised wisdom, but often seemed to contradict each other on fundamental questions. She'd learned it through conversations with other single mothers at the grocery store, who'd offered knowing looks and sympathetic smiles. Women who understood exactly what it meant to try to raise a child alone in a world that seemed designed for dual-parent households. Margaret knew the importance of trust. She knew that if Emma felt constantly monitored and questioned, the teenager would only withdraw further, creating more distance between them. But the knowledge didn't make it any easier to ignore her instincts, which were screaming that something was different about her daughter. That evening, Margaret found herself at the window while washing dishes, her hands submerged in warm soapy water that had begun to cool. The bubbles had mostly disappeared, leaving only the slick feeling of soap against her skin. She'd read somewhere that doing dishes mindfully, paying attention to the sensations, could be a form of meditation. She'd tried it a few times but had never quite managed to clear her mind completely. There were always too many thoughts, too many worries, too many questions left unanswered. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that made small towns feel like they existed outside of time, preserved in amber, untouched by the rapid changes happening in the world beyond their borders. It was the kind of quiet that could be either peaceful or isolating, depending on one's mood. Maple trees lined the street in front of the house and on both sides of the road, their branches beginning to turn gold and crimson at the edges, as autumn advanced with its slow, inevitable march toward winter. The trees had been planted in the 1950s, she'd learned from a neighbor, as part of a community beautification project. Now they provided shade in summer and spectacular color in fall, their value having only increased with time. She'd lived here for 8 years, ever since the accident that had taken Richard, but she'd never really paid attention to the neighborhood beyond the basics. Who paid their property taxes on time? Which neighbors had maintained their properties well, and which ones had let them fall into disrepair? Whose dogs barked at night and disturbed her sleep? Which houses had well-maintained gardens and which ones had begun to look neglected? The neighborhood had been something she moved through rather than something she truly inhabited, a series of background details in the daily choreography of survival. The library closed at 6 o'clock on weekdays. Emma didn't come home until 7:30 or sometimes later. Margaret calculated the time in her head as she dried each dish carefully, placing them in their designated spots in the cupboard. 15 minutes to get from school to the library. The school was on the north side of town and the library was downtown, requiring either a bus ride or a bike ride depending on the weather and Emma's mood. 50 minutes at the library. If Emma was actually going to the library and studying, which should have been enough time for significant work. 15 minutes to get home. That was only an hour and 40 minutes accounted for out of the 90 minutes that Emma was unaccounted for. What about the other 50 minutes? Where was Emma spending that time? Margaret didn't mention her calculations to Emma. Instead, she watched. She observed the pattern that emerged over the following days like a photograph developing in a darkroom, slowly coming into focus as the chemicals worked on the paper. Emma would leave for school at 7:45, timing her departure perfectly to catch the first bus. She would arrive home from the library at 7:30 or 7:45, sometimes even at 8 o'clock. Her hair would be different on some days, carefully braided, styled with attention that suggested purpose beyond academic research, the kind of purposeful styling that a teenage girl did for specific reasons. Her cheeks would be flushed with color that could have been from exertion or from cold air, or from something else entirely. There would be a specific quality to her smile on those days, something private and knowing that Margaret recognized because she'd felt it herself years ago. When she was young and falling in love and believed that her feelings were unique and unprecedented, Margaret realized that her daughter was keeping a secret. The only question was what that secret was. On Thursday, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She borrowed her neighbor's car, making up an excuse about her own car needing an oil change, a lie she felt guilty about even as she spoke it, and drove to the library. She told herself it was casual, Just a random thought that had occurred to her, but she knew she was lying to herself. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel too tightly, her jaw was clenched, and her heart was racing as she drove through the familiar streets of the town. She parked in the rear lot, avoiding the spaces near the main entrance, and walked in through the side entrance near the fiction section. The library was a beautifully restored Carnegie building from the early 1900s, all high ceilings and tall windows and wooden bookshelves that had been polished to a gleaming shine. It was the kind of place that should have been Margaret's refuge, a space filled with endless stories and possibilities, but today it felt charged with tension and suspicion. Emma was there, in the reading area near the reference desk, sitting in a study carrel by the window. Her laptop was open, and she appeared to be reading something on the screen with intense concentration. She looked peaceful, focused, entirely absorbed in whatever she was doing, untouched by the drama and worry that Margaret was experiencing just a few feet away. Hidden behind the stacks of fiction, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she hadn't even fully acknowledged until that moment. She'd been carrying tension in her shoulders and her jaw all week, worried about what she might discover. The history project must be real. Emma must simply be exaggerating the time spent there. Or perhaps she was stopping somewhere else on the way home, a coffee shop maybe, or the bookstore that had opened downtown 2 years ago and had become a popular gathering place for teenagers. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Margaret clung to this hope as she stood there watching her daughter work, and felt the sharp, complicated pang of how little she actually knew about her daughter's inner world. Emma's face in profile showed concentration, intelligence, a kind of mature thoughtfulness that Margaret hadn't noticed developing. When had her little girl become this young woman? It seemed to have happened gradually, imperceptibly, so slowly that Margaret had missed the actual transformation, even though she'd been present for all of it. Margaret turned and left the library without approaching Emma, driving back to her house with a sense of relief. The historical project was real. Emma was doing schoolwork. There was nothing to worry about. Margaret pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, trying to calm her racing heart and wondering why she felt like she'd been holding her breath all day. But that night, Emma came home at 7:45 and her hair was different. It had been styled in a braid, not a casual, messy braid that a person would create themselves, but a careful, intricate braid that must have been created by someone else, someone who had taken time and care with the styling. It was adorned with a small silver clasp that Margaret had never seen before, a delicate piece that must have cost money. That must have been intentionally chosen or gifted, and there was something else, something that made Margaret's stomach twist with a mixture of concern and alarm, a slight mark on her neck, just below her left ear, a small reddish discoloration that looked suspiciously like it could have been made by lips pressed against skin, or fingers holding skin, or the kind of passionate contact that Margaret remembered from her own teenage years. Margaret felt her carefully maintained calm begin to crumble. She said nothing that evening, but later, after Emma was in bed, she lay awake in her own bedroom, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities both terrible and mundane. She thought about all the ways a teenage girl could get into trouble. She thought about predators and manipulation. She thought about older men taking advantage of younger girls. She thought about all the ways a mother could fail to protect her child. She thought about Richard, who would have known what to do, who would have had the right words to say, who would have made these terrible worries feel manageable through the sheer force of his presence. She spent the night in this state of anxiety, her mind churning, her heart jumping at every small sound, and by morning she had resolved to learn more about whoever Emma was seeing. She had gone from passive observation to active investigation, crossing a line that she would later wish she hadn't crossed, though at the time it seemed like the only responsible course of action. Saturday morning, Margaret decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. She told herself it was for exercise, for fresh air, for mental health, but she knew that subconsciously she was also doing reconnaissance, trying to gather information about the town her daughter inhabited when Margaret wasn't around. The neighborhood looked different when you actually paid attention to it, as if by truly observing it for the first time, she was somehow making it real in a way it hadn't been before. She noticed things she'd never seen before in all her years of living here. The renovation at the old Henderson's place, where new windows had been installed and the garden had been completely redone with native plants and carefully placed stones that formed a decorative pattern. She noticed the new community garden 3 blocks over, where several families were tending raised beds even as the season was beginning to turn, preparing for the transition from fall to winter. She noticed the antique shop that had opened on Main Street last spring, its window display featuring an exquisite collection of vintage jewelry and old books, things with history and stories attached to them. She noticed the mural on the side of the courthouse, a beautiful, intricate painting of the town's founding that depicted a woman standing at the edge of a forest, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that could be interpreted as either longing or resolution, depending on how you looked at it and what mood you were in. At the library that afternoon, Margaret felt like a spy, like a detective character in a television show searching for clues in her own daughter's life. She knew Emma's password. They'd set it up together years ago when Emma first got an email account, and Emma had never thought to change it, had probably never considered that her mother might have kept it written down or memorized it. Margaret hated herself for what she was about to do, despised the violation of trust that she was about to commit. But she did it anyway. She logged into the computer terminal that Emma usually used, checking the browser history with a mixture of guilt and anxiety that made her hands tremble slightly. The history showed academic searches, college websites, creative writing forums, articles about environmental conservation and historical preservation. The searches were interesting. They suggested that Emma was concerned with something beyond typical teenage interests, something more substantial. But there were gaps, times when the computer had clearly been used but the history had been cleared, leaving no trace of where Emma's attention had wandered, suggesting deliberate concealment. That's when Margaret noticed something else, something that shifted the entire nature of her investigation. The library had undergone a renovation last year, an ambitious project that had taken several months and had cost the town a significant amount of money. A new section had been added to the building, an east wing with tall windows overlooking the ravine that cut through the landscape behind the building, a dramatic drop filled with trees and the constant sound of running water. She'd walked past it 100 times in the years since the renovation and never really looked, never really absorbed what was there. The expansion had seemed like a strange choice for a small town, unnecessary expenditure, but now she began to understand its appeal. She walked into the east wing and felt immediately transported to a different space. The light was different here, filtered through the tall windows, creating patterns on the wooden floor. The books seemed to be carefully curated, focusing on poetry, art, history, architectural studies, subjects that appealed more to the thoughtful, contemplative reader than to someone doing simple homework research. The space had a quietness to it, a sense of peace and preservation that distinguished it from the rest of the library. Inside this section, tucked among the poetry collections and art books, sections that hardly anyone used anymore, now that reading had become a predominantly digital pursuit for most people, now that young people spent their time on screens rather than in the physical world, was a journal. It was leather-bound, expensive-looking, clearly well-loved and frequently used, its pages worn soft from handling. It was left open on one of the window seats as if someone had just stepped away, as if the reader intended to return momentarily and didn't want to lose their place. Margaret's heart began to race. She knew she shouldn't look. Every instinct, every principle of parenting that she'd learned and absorbed over the years from books and advice columns and support groups told her to back away, to respect privacy, to trust her daughter. But she also knew that she needed to understand what was happening, that her maternal concern outweighed her respect for privacy. She did it anyway. The handwriting on the page was not her daughter's. It was masculine with bold strokes and careful letters, the writing of someone who considered their words carefully before committing them to paper, someone who valued precision and clarity. The text was in English, written in a careful, thoughtful style that suggested education and intelligence. The ravine is like another world. From up here you can see everything, the river, the old mill with its broken windows and collapsed roof, standing like a skeleton against the sky, the way the light hits the water at sunset, creating gold and crimson patterns that change from moment to moment as the sun descends toward the horizon. Emma showed me the way the ancient stones of the foundation still hold their shape after more than 100 years, the way the mortar between them has weathered, but not failed. She showed me the history of it, how it used to power the whole town back when industry meant something different than it does now, how the people who built it are all gone now, All of them dead for decades, but their work remains, and the ravine remembers. It remembers the sound of the mill wheel turning, the energy flowing, the purpose and meaning that had once animated this place. Now there's only silence and beauty and slow decay. But maybe that's beautiful too. Maybe that's what preservation means. Not stopping time, but honoring what has been, acknowledging its importance even as it changes. She understands this. She sees what I see. That's rare. That's extraordinary. The handwriting wasn't Emma's, but her name was scattered throughout the entry like a refrain in a song, appearing again and again, showing up at key moments in the narrative. Margaret's mind raced with questions and terrible possibilities. She felt her stomach clench with worry. The journal was clearly not something written casually. It was thoughtful, reflective, written with care and intelligence. But the subject matter, an older man becoming emotionally invested in a 17-year-old girl, made Margaret's protective instincts scream with alarm. She carefully photographed the page with her phone, her hands shaking slightly, trying to make sure the image was clear and readable. She then closed the journal gently and put it back exactly where she'd found it, trying to arrange everything so that it looked undisturbed, untouched, as if she'd never been there at all. But her heart was hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage, desperate for escape. Her mind cycled through terrible scenarios. Who was he? How long had this been going on? What exactly was their relationship? What was happening in that ravine? And why did the description of his feelings for Emma make Margaret's protective instincts scream and her hands shake? Part 2. Descending into mystery. That evening, unable to wait any longer, unable to contain the worry that was consuming her, Margaret drove to the ravine. The route took her through the industrial section of town, past abandoned factories and shuttered shops, grim reminders of an economic era that had ended decades ago, remnants of an era when the town had mattered more to the broader economy, when the mill had been vital to the local community and regional industry. The buildings seemed to watch her pass, their empty windows like accusing eyes. The old mill stood like a skeleton against the darkening sky, its wooden beams weathered silver by decades of wind and rain and neglect. Its broken windows were like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing, seeing nothing, offering nothing. The structure looked simultaneously tragic and beautiful, like a monument to time's passage, to the inevitable decay of all human works, to the way that even the grandest structures eventually crumble and fade. Someone had been working on the caretaker's cottage nearby. Margaret hadn't even known that anyone lived out here, hadn't known that the cottage could be restored to habitability. The small structure, which had previously been little more than a run-down shed, had been carefully renovated. Its roof had been repaired and sealed against the weather. Its windows had been replaced with new glass that gleamed in the fading light. The walls had been sanded and painted a soft gray color that complemented the landscape. Smoke curled from the chimney in delicate wisps, carrying the scent of burning wood into the cool evening air, mixing with the smell of the ravine, earth and water and growing things. Margaret didn't approach. Instead, she sat in her car and thought about her daughter, who was growing up in a world that Margaret had been too focused on survival to fully see. She thought about how she'd been so concerned with keeping Emma safe, with preventing disaster, with protecting her from all the terrible things that could happen to a young girl. That she'd failed to notice Emma becoming her own person, with her own passions, her own mysteries, her own reasons for existing beyond her role as Margaret's daughter. The sun set over the ravine, turning the sky into shades of orange and purple and deep indigo, the colors bleeding into each other like watercolors on wet paper. Margaret watched the colors deepen and change, watched the world transform as darkness gradually came, and she made a decision. She couldn't spy on her daughter's private life. She couldn't treat her like a suspect to be investigated, a criminal to be caught in the act. She couldn't continue down this path of deception and surveillance. But she could insist on truth. She could demand that her daughter open up to her, that they communicate like the family they still were, that they talk about the important things that seemed to be happening in Emma's life. On Monday, Margaret did something she'd never done before in all of Emma's school years. She called the school and asked to speak with Mrs. Patterson, identified herself as Emma's mother, and asked about the history project that Emma had been working on so diligently. Emma's history project? The teacher repeated, her voice carrying a note of confusion that immediately confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions. Mrs. Chen, I didn't assign a history project this semester. Emma's in my English class and we're just starting our literature unit. We're reading contemporary fiction and analyzing themes of identity and change. Emma's actually doing quite well with the material. The lie hit Margaret like a physical thing, a stone dropped into still water, creating expanding ripples of concern and hurt and betrayal. She thanked the teacher quietly and hung up, her hands shaking, the phone feeling suddenly very heavy in her grip, as if it had accumulated weight through bearing bad news. That night, Margaret made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She was going to have this conversation with her daughter. She was going to force the truth out into the open, where it could be examined in the light. Emma came home at 7:40, her hair carefully styled, her neck bearing that suspicious mark, and Margaret was waiting in the living room with 2 mugs of tea. She'd prepared the tea carefully with honey and lemon, the same way Emma had always liked it since she was a child, making a small gesture toward comfort and connection, even as she was preparing to interrogate her daughter about potentially dangerous situations. "We need to talk," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the nervousness coursing through her, adrenaline making everything feel slightly unreal, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. Emma's face went pale in stages, the color draining gradually like someone had opened a valve and let all her courage leak out. She sat down slowly, as if her bones had suddenly turned to water, as if the very act of sitting upright required tremendous concentration and effort. She stared at her lap, unable or unwilling to meet Margaret's eyes. "I know you're not going to the library," Margaret continued quietly, keeping her voice gentle but firm, trying to strike the right balance between compassion and authority. "I know there's someone. I need you to tell me who, and I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Every detail." Emma stared at her lap for a long time, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across her daughter's face. The war between privacy and honesty, between autonomy and the need for maternal guidance, between independence and the security of connection. It was the face of someone wrestling with a difficult truth, someone deciding how much to reveal, someone considering the consequences of honesty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Emma looked up, and Margaret saw real passion in her daughter's eyes, an intensity that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside her, an intelligence and conviction that Margaret hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. "His name is David," Emma said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "He's 23. He's the new historical preservationist. He came to the county 6 months ago to work on a grant project." Margaret felt something shift inside her. The age gap registered immediately, creating a jolt of concern. At 23, David was significantly older than Emma. At 17, Emma was in her senior year of high school, while David was entering the world of adult work and responsibilities. The age difference felt substantial, felt potentially problematic, felt like it could mask manipulation or exploitation. But something else in Emma's voice, the genuine conviction, the seriousness of her tone, the way she spoke about David with respect rather than with the giddy infatuation of a girl with a crush, made Margaret pause before reacting with alarm. "He's been documenting the mill and the ravine," Emma continued, speaking faster now as if the words had been pent up inside her and were eager to escape. "It's supposed to be protected under state law, but nobody in town cares. The county wants to demolish everything and sell the land to developers who want to build a shopping center or condominiums or something generic and soulless. David came here specifically to try to save it. He's doing an assessment of the structure, documenting its historical significance, trying to prove that it's worth preserving." Margaret absorbed this information, trying to process it into something coherent, something that made sense. This didn't sound like the story of a predator grooming a young girl. This sounded like something else entirely. "How did you meet him?" Margaret asked, leaning forward slightly, trying to understand how this relationship had begun. "The library," Emma said, and Margaret recognized the truth in this detail. At least part of Emma's story had been accurate all along. Emma had genuinely been going to the library. "I was reading about local history for a real assignment. Mrs. Patterson did assign a research project about the town's development, and he was there researching the same thing. I showed him some sources I'd found in the archive section. He was looking at old newspaper archives trying to track the mill's history, looking for documented information about when it was built and how it operated and how it eventually closed. I showed him some things I'd discovered about the town's economic development, and we just started talking. It was like a natural thing. We had this instant connection over the material. Emma talked with increasing confidence as she continued, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. Months of keeping this secret finally being released. The tension in her shoulders began to ease as she spoke, and Margaret watched her daughter relax slightly, as if the weight of keeping this hidden had been crushing her. "Mom, he's not like anyone I know," Emma said, her eyes bright with conviction. "He actually cares about things, about history, about beauty, about preservation. Everyone else our age is just worried about college applications and social media, and fitting in and what they're wearing and who likes them. But David is doing something important. He's trying to save something that matters, something real. He's teaching me to see the town differently. To see what matters. To understand that there's beauty in old things, in forgotten places, in the stories that nobody is paying attention to anymore." Margaret listened as Emma talked about David's work, his dreams, the way he made her feel less alone in a small town that had never quite fit either of them. She heard the genuine intellectual stimulation in her daughter's voice. The sense of being truly seen and understood by another person, the excitement of connecting with someone who shared her values and her vision for what life could mean. She heard something else too, something that made her heart ache with recognition. The same restlessness that had driven Margaret herself at that age, the desperate need to find meaning beyond the confines of her hometown, to connect with someone who understood her on a deeper level than her peers did. When Emma finally finished speaking, tears streamed down her face. Tears that seemed to be a mixture of relief at finally being able to tell someone about this secret that had been consuming her thoughts, vulnerability at exposing her feelings to her mother's judgment, and fear of losing her mother's love and acceptance. Margaret set down her tea carefully on the coffee table. "I want to meet him," she said. "Properly. You'll invite him here on a Saturday for dinner, and if anything feels off, anything at all, if I see any sign that he's taking advantage of you or manipulating you or not respecting your boundaries and your autonomy, we're done. This ends immediately." "Understood?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Margaret said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But I remember what it was like to be 17 and feel like nobody understood. Your father did understand, though, remember? He was 5 years older than me. We met when I was 17 and he was 22. And I fell in love with him because he treated me like an adult, like someone worth listening to, like someone whose ideas and thoughts and feelings mattered. But he was careful about that. He was respectful. He never took advantage of the age difference. I need to know that this man understands that he has a responsibility to respect you, that he knows the power dynamic exists, and that he's not going to abuse it." The following Saturday, David arrived at precisely 6 o'clock with flowers and a bottle of wine. He was thoughtful enough to bring these things, Margaret noted, showing respect for his host. He was handsome in an unconventional way, his face angular, his eyes intelligent and observant, his smile genuine rather than practiced or performed. His dark hair was slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been working outdoors, his hands bearing the small calluses and dirt stains of someone who actually did physical labor, someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty in service of his work. Over dinner, which Margaret had spent the afternoon preparing, a careful meal designed to seem effortless but which had actually required significant planning and effort, Margaret watched David interact with Emma. She observed the careful way he listened when she spoke, never interrupting, never dismissing her thoughts or speaking over her. She watched the respect visible in his eyes, the way he asked questions that showed he'd actually paid attention to what she said, that he cared about her perspective and valued her input. She watched Emma too, carefully monitoring her daughter's body language and her responses. She saw her daughter transformed by being truly seen, by being treated as an intelligent equal rather than as an amusing child or as an object of desire. Margaret saw the light in her daughter's eyes, a light that had perhaps been dimming in the previous years as Emma navigated the challenges of high school and tried to find her place in a world that often seemed hostile to intelligent, thoughtful young women who didn't fit neatly into expected categories. They discussed the mill's history during dinner, and David's passion for his work became immediately evident. He explained how the structure had been built in 1887, how it had been a state-of-the-art facility at the time, how it had employed more than 200 people at its peak, how it had been central to the town's economic identity, providing employment and prosperity to an entire community. He talked about the architecture, the engineering sophistication that seemed remarkable for its time, the way the building had been designed to last centuries, with materials chosen carefully and construction methods that demonstrated deep knowledge and expertise. He talked about his vision for preservation, not necessarily to get the mill running again, though that was theoretically possible, but to transform it into something that served the community in a new way, that honored its past while creating space for a new future. "I want to turn it into a cultural center," David said, his eyes lighting up as he spoke, his voice carrying the passionate conviction of someone who genuinely believed in the importance of his work. "A space where people can gather, learn about local history, create art, host performances, hold classes. The ravine could be restored as well. There are hiking trails we could establish, areas for outdoor education. The whole complex could become a destination, a place of beauty and learning instead of just being allowed to decay and be forgotten." Emma reached over and squeezed his hand, and Margaret saw the genuine affection between them, not the desperate, obsessive passion of an older man exploiting a younger woman, but rather a real connection, a meeting of minds and hearts, a genuine partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. Margaret felt some of her tension begin to ease, though she remained vigilant, still watching carefully for any sign of manipulation or inappropriate dynamics. They moved to the porch as the sun set, turning the sky into shades of amber and rose and deep purple, the colors bleeding into each other like watercolors on wet paper. The evening air was cool, carrying the promise of approaching autumn, and Margaret brought out blankets that they could wrap around themselves. David told them about his background, his history, the path that had led him to this work. He talked about growing up in a small town himself, about watching historic buildings disappear, replaced by strip malls and generic development, about feeling a sense of loss as his community's character and identity were erased in the name of progress. He told them about going to college, studying architecture and historic preservation, developing a philosophy about the importance of maintaining connection to the past, even as society moved forward. He talked about his decision to dedicate his professional life to saving places that mattered, to fighting against the